Good. Well, it's lovely to be back. I do feel somewhat clerical standing up here, but it's not a sermon, I hope anyway. So I'll manage. That's fine. I kind of don't use my notes that much anyway. Okay, so I've been back. I think this is the second or third one I've done here. I did a couple for you during COVID lockdown, and back at the old place in Liam Court Road. So I still haven't run out of things to say on the Crystal Palace yet. So this one is all about music and the Crystal Palace. And I think we have to go right the way back to the idea of the Great Exhibition itself to get a clue as to why music was so central to the Crystal Palace story. I should have mentioned that I'm a trustee of the Crystal Palace Foundation, which does all things connected with the history and heritage of the old Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace on the where it was moved. We do archaeology there, we make publications, we do talks, which I do all over the place, and we're a membership charity as well, just like the Streatham Society. Now, just to return to what I was saying, so this was the setting up of the Great Exhibition, which was an idea sort of jointly from Prince Albert and Henry Cole. And I'll spare you the bits I've told you before, so I'll assume that some of you listened to some of my other stuff. But this is a painting that I think is now in the V&A of the Royal Commissioners when they set up the commission in 1849. And from a meeting, they managed to get the whole Great Exhibition together in 2 years, which is quite a considerable achievement when you think how long it takes us not to do HS2 or something like that. And we have Prince Albert in the centre being presented the design of the Crystal Palace building by Joseph Paxton, and he's surrounded by many other worthies and the great and the good of the middle of the 19th century. Sir Robert Peel, there's Robert Stevenson, there's Henry Cole himself, there's Cubitt, there's Lord Derby, there's Lord John Russell, all part of the exhibition committee planners. And it was designed to be a great celebration of everything that was good about the wonderful progress that was being made in their view with Britain at the centre of it that they wanted to show. Now, the key part of showing this is the Prince Albert bit. So he was a very, very good amateur musician. These are two of his compositions. And the one on it's only January the 7th, so I included a Christmas one for Hark the Herald Angels Sing, which wasn't an established hymn tune that we know then. So it was a set of words that anybody could have a go at, and Prince Albert did. He wrote piano pieces, he was an accomplished pianist, so he was always going to have an interest in the musical side of things. A musician and a composer. Now, cut to the chase, the Great Exhibition itself opened on the 1st of May, 1851. And it was built in this building that we all recognize now, the Crystal Palace, designed by Sir Joseph Paxton, the winner of the competition that they held to design the building for the Great Exhibition. Many designs submitted, but Paxton's was the one that was selected almost at the last minute. And was such an occasion. And it was a royal occasion, so therefore it was marked by great public interest. They say that there were about 500,000 people in Hyde Park just to be there for the opening of the Great Exhibition. There are loads more you can see that were actually invited into the building, and music was an incredible part of this opening, and that's where the story starts, really. The history of the palace is marked by many memorable musical performances, and always on a grand scale. So for the opening itself, there were a very large number of singers and instrumental musicians performing in the centre transept here under the direction of a great 19th century musical figure called William Sterndale Bennett, who'd been a pupil of Mendelssohn. And there was a great focus then on the music of Handel, and when the royal party arrived, everybody heard the Hallelujah chorus played by the musicians and the choir. I've got a contemporary account here of this occasion with a focus on the music. When Her Majesty had taken her seat in the chair of state, the national anthem was performed under the direction of Sir George Smart, organist and composer to Her Majesty's Chapel Royal, by the choirs of the Chapel Royal, St Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, St George's Chapel, Windsor, some of the pupils of the Royal Academy of Music, with the chorus and part of the band of the Sacred Harmonic Society, and many other performers, both foreign and English, accompanied on the organ, built by Messrs Gray and Davison, by Goss, organist of St Paul's Cathedral, and Mr Turle, organist of Westminster Abbey. Now that was the first music that was heard in the Crystal Palace, but by no means the last. And music was then heard at every part of the building as part of the opening. And the royal procession was then formed. So the music just didn't stay in one place, because there were people straining for views all over the building. If you remember the coronation, where people were seen to be sat in all different places in Westminster Abbey. This, if you can even imagine it, is on a much grander scale. And again, this is this contemporary writer continues about the royal procession. They marched to the west end of the nave by its north side, returning to the east end by the south side. As the procession approached the west end, the magnificent organ by Mr. Willis, with its 4,000 pipes, commenced playing the national anthem, which was heard to the remotest end of the building. Now, to give you an idea of the scale of reach of that music, just give you a couple of views of the central transept and the nave spreading from one direction. So with a Willis organ at one end of it, they could still hear the music at the other side. And from that point forward, the Great Exhibition and the whole notion of the Crystal Palace and what it was trying to achieve in being this great showcase of Victorian achievement did capture the mood. Let's see if the pointer works now. Let's see if there we are. This thing here is a crystal fountain, which is designed by a firm in Birmingham called Osler, and was really the centerpiece of the Great Exhibition. It was then moved to the Crystal Palace site at Sydenham as well. And that inspired this. So people were writing music for the Great Exhibition. So this is the Crystal Fountain Polka. I don't think it's the most inspiring piece that's ever been written. This is the original that I've got in my own collection. And I have tried it, and I don't recommend anybody else try it, actually. It's a bit fiddly, and the best thing about it is the picture on the cover. That's a polka. There were in the kind of the music carried on being on display, if you like. There were many, many exhibits from all over the world, although the music tended to be incredibly Western. Here you can see Jersey and Guernsey and Ceylon, as it was called then. And they each had a section of the Crystal Palace. This one here is the Indian section. Now, India was really, really important to what was then the British Empire, and it had the biggest display. I won't do anecdotes about the India display, because I think I've told you them before, but if there's room at the end in the questions, remind me if somebody wants to know them, and then we'll go back to that slide or something. But there you have quite what we'd say would be not a very politically correct display these days. It's actually a real stuffed elephant, and there's a lot of carved ivory on display. So not what we'd expect to see these days, but as far as the Great Exhibition and the Victorians were concerned, that's what they came to see. Now, in addition to the exhibits from all over the world, there were specialist exhibits that were manufactures and arts and textiles and goodness knows what else that were contributed from this country and other countries. There were over 100,000 exhibits throughout the building, and that included music. These two organs were on display at the Great Exhibition. The Henry Willis Grand Organ is on the left there, and there was a competition in each category of exhibits in the Crystal Palace. And there were medals handed out for the best exhibit and the most exciting exhibit that the judges thought worthy of the medal. And the Willis organ, when that was played and heard by the judges, then that won hands down all the plaudits and the medal for that category. And from that point on, the Willis organ really became the model for the development of organs in the churches that sprang up in the second half of the 19th century, and those that had other organs installed. This one, because obviously the exhibition didn't stay in Hyde Park, everything was dispersed either back to the countries it came from, things were bought. This one ended up in Winchester Cathedral. So, oops, I've lens on it. Let's try. Shall we try again? There we are, that's better. I shall hold it in my hand. So this one ended up in Winchester Cathedral. It was played at the opening ceremony by the organist from Winchester Cathedral, who was one of the Wesley family. This was Samuel Sebastian Wesley of the famous English church music family, and was quite influential in getting this organ into Winchester Cathedral when its period of service at the Great Exhibition was over. There were many others on display too. Gray and Davison were great organ makers, and there was stuff on a more domestic scale, like this Walker organ, which is on the right there. And to show you the influence of the Great Exhibition display on organ making in the UK, and other keyboard instruments. There were many other great pianos on display, all designed for the Great Exhibition. There were Broadwood pianos and pianos from many other countries. And there were only, in 1800, 50 years before the exhibition, there were only a dozen makes of organ and keyboard that you could get. By 1860, there were between 200 and 300 people making pianos, and more people trying to contribute to organ manufacturers. There were also harps on display and woodwind and brass instruments. And these are music instruments that were newly made by Adolphe Sax, who was a Belgian but based in Paris. And of course, we owe Adolphe Sax the saxophone. So it was a new instrument that was being developed in the middle of the 19th century. And people who came to the Great Exhibition would have seen some of the very, very first saxophones. So whoever your favorite saxophone player is, then the people will have seen the very earliest saxophones at the Great Exhibition. And there were, I have to put my cards on the table here. I'm a clarinet and saxophone player as well, so hence I put this one in. And the modern system for clarinets and saxophones and flutes was developed by an instrument maker called Boehm. That's B-O-E-H-M. And He had displays at the Crystal Palace and won all the medals, and his system for clarinets is still used today. So it overtook what was then called a simple system clarinet or an Albert system clarinet, and I've played both, and I can tell you that the Boehm system is a lot easier. So there is quite a lot of musical legacy from the Crystal Palace already coming. So it wasn't all exactly straight stuff. Here's something that didn't catch on. This is another piano, but a bit experimental. It's a double piano at both ends. So the keyboard is twice as long as you'd expect it to be, and there's another one at the other end as well. So it was for 4 hands at this end and 4 hands at the other end. I've no idea what kind of noise it made. It didn't catch on, and I think probably we should be fairly grateful, actually. I don't know who would have been interested in buying it, but hey. So the exhibition closed on the 11th of October, 1851. Over 6 million people had visited since May of 1851. The population of London was only about 2.3 million at the 1851 census. So if you think there's 3 times the population of London came to see the Great Exhibition, and so you can start to see the influence that it had. It made a profit. It was not a private enterprise, it was a state enterprise with a royal commission behind it, and Prince Albert. So it made a profit of £186,000. Now, that wasn't going into anybody's back pocket. It had to be used, and Prince Albert and the commissioners wanted it to be used to carry on that spirit of learning and that spirit of enterprise. And the main centre of all the learned societies and so on at that time was Piccadilly. If you walk along Piccadilly and you get to the Royal Academy, you'll see the Royal Academy and the Society of Antiquaries and the Linnean Society and so on. And Albert was determined to try and switch the focus to Kensington, where his Great Exhibition had been. And so they used the money, the profit from the Great Exhibition, to purchase a big patch of land in South Kensington. Imagine purchasing a huge patch of land for £186,000 in Kensington now, or Streatham for that matter. And they set up what has become known as Albertopolis, and it's where the V&A Museum is now, it's where the Science Museum is, it's where the Natural History Museum, it's where the great centres of learning like Imperial College are, it's where the Royal Geographical Society is, the Royal Albert Hall came to be built there later, and it's also, and this was also part of the Great Exhibition legacy, where they put, because of this profit that was spent on it, the Royal College of Music and the Royal College of Organists. So without the Great Exhibition, then we wouldn't have such a great legacy. And think of the musicians and music that has come out of both of those institutions since 1851. So, what next? Where to? What to do with it? The Crystal Palace had been put there and was clearly very popular. So they thought, well, we'll just take it down then. Because it was the world's first prefabricated glass and iron structure ever, certainly at scale of that sort as well. So there was a clamour for it to continue to exist. It couldn't continue to exist in Hyde Park. It was a royal park and had trees built in it as well. Well, it was built over Hyde Park trees. So they had to dismantle it. I'll cut the long story short, because I've told you this bit before. And it was transferred to what was then called Penge Place, which we now know, of course, as Crystal Palace Park. And there was a mansion in the middle of it that happened to be owned by one of the directors of the Crystal Palace Company, which is quite a nice coincidence, who was also a director of the London and Brighton and South Coast Railway. So you can start joining up the dots. and it had a little lake in front of it. Later on, I'll talk about the Crystal Palace Concert Bowl. That sits on the site of where Penge Place used to be, the actual mansion. And the secretary of the newly formed Crystal Palace Company was one George Grove, which is a name I'd like you to just log for the moment, because I'm going to come back to George Grove. So we get to the Crystal Palace at Sydenham. Much different building, even though the style of it is the same. It's twice as big as the Great Exhibition Building. So it's gone from 3 stories to 6 stories. You can see the centre transept there. You can also see the south transept over that side. There was another matching one. So they really expand. Paxton expanded the Crystal Palace to fit the site that he suddenly found he was able to use. He'd been the estates manager and developer for the Duke of Devonshire up at Chatsworth. So he was used to landscaping grounds, and he landscaped the whole park to fit with this new building. We got the magnificent Italianate terracing that was built near the building, which is obviously still there. Though you can see some of the terracing still there post-fire. Or if you didn't know there was a fire, by the way, I'm sorry if I've spoiled it for you. But we'll come to that as well, because that has a musical story attached to it too. And give you an idea of Paxton's grounds. This is from a painting by a Victorian artist called Duffield Harding. It's owned by the Royal Institute of British Architects, and the foundation have had permission to use it. And we've made a jigsaw puzzle out of this as well. There is one over there, first come, first served, if anybody wants to buy it in the shop area, but it's also on our website. This dates from 1856, because they didn't get the fountains working until then. The actual opening of the new Crystal Palace in the Sydenham site was June 1854, but this is such a terrific painting that it really gives us an idea of the whole site and the scale of it. And right in the foreground here, you can see the dinosaurs, which we still can visit, and all the way up through there, just in the centre there, where the central fountain basin was. That's where we come to know where the sports centre is, and then the terracing, where I'm sure some of us have seen fireworks and so on, and then the building itself, and the 2 water towers, which are the only thing that are not Paxton, because he couldn't get the fountains to work that he wanted to get to work, so we got Brunel to do it for him. All the great Victorian minds were involved in this. So what we had is another great royal opening, 10th of June 1854, choir of hundreds. And they performed with a vast orchestra, bands of the Coldstream and the Grenadier Guards, and 60 band instrumentalists of the Crystal Palace Company, and that set the pattern for the next stage of music at the Crystal Palace. Now, they took it very, very seriously. Here's a shot of the inside, just to give you an idea of the scale again. That's just looking down the nave again. And here's a ticket for the band rehearsal before the opening. So this is 2 days before it opened. And this is not for a member of the public to come and watch the rehearsal. This is for one of the musicians. And this is for the first violin. And on the back of the ticket is a map of the orchestra and where everybody is supposed to sit. Now, if you think of all those musicians I just listed, it was a pretty large group of musicians, and they were really very, very tight on security. As you can, I don't know if you can read it there, it gives people instructions on how to get there by train. It tells you exactly the entrance to go in, and it's been signed off by the superintendent of the Crystal Palace. And so all of these musicians, and I think this is a Mr. Morell, who was the first violin, one of the first violin players, would have had a designated seat and a designated music stand. And there's a very precise map. You might just be able to see these curved lines, which are coming through from the back of the ticket. So they produced all of those, which gives you a hint of the importance they were starting to place on the Crystal Palace. You won't see this anywhere else, because this is in my own collection as well. So You're getting stuff that you won't ever see again. Now, I asked you to remember the name of the secretary of the Crystal Palace Company. It's not a quiz, I'll ask you for a show of hands, but it was George Grove, or Sir George Grove as he became. And we need to talk about Sir George Grove and another figure, and these were central to the development of music at the Palace. And so Sir George Grove and Sir August Mans, who was actually Prussian. Sir George Grove was an engineer by training. He designed lighthouses and bridges and had worked on the Menai Straits Bridge, the Britannia Bridge with Stevenson. But he was also a rather interested person as far as music was concerned. We'll come to that. And he was encouraged by Stevenson and Brunel, amongst others, to apply to be secretary of the Royal Society of Arts. Now, the Royal Society of Arts had been behind the Great Exhibition. That's the organisation that was behind it. Prince Albert was the president of the Royal Society of Arts. I'm delighted to be a fellow of the RSA, my own day job has had an exhibition there this year, so it's a nice full circle. He was offered the post of secretary of the Crystal Palace Company. He became secretary of the RSA as well. And for those of you who are musicians amongst us, or those who are interested in the history of music, he was the one that came up with the famous Dictionary of Music and Musicians, the Grove Dictionary. If you go to your local library, assuming there are local libraries anymore, but then they will usually have a copy of Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians. It's probably on its about 20th edition by now. Now, I would suggest that George Grove made one of the most important appointments in 19th century music when he made Sir August Mans music director. There's a slight story behind that, though, because the original music director was a Henry Schallen, a German military bandmaster, and he was just appointed by Grove to form a military band to entertain visitors to the Crystal Palace, quite a low level. And he'd appointed him for the grand opening, and Mans was actually appointed as assistant conductor and as a clarinetist. So there's the clarinetist connection again. And Mans played clarinet at the opening ceremony in front of the Queen. And the next major event at the palace was a fete to raise money for the widows and orphans of the soldiers and the troops fighting in the Crimea at the same time. I think it's difficult sometimes when you're talking about the Great Exhibition and the Crystal Palace reopening in Sydenham to think that there are other events going on in the world, and it was the time of the Crimean War. And Schallen asked Mans to compose a special piece for it, which he did. Took a lot of time and trouble for it. And when Mans was then shown the proofs of the printed copies, he saw that Schallen had put his name on it. And he'd taken the credit for this piece, and not only taken the credit for it, he'd taken the cheque for it as well. So he'd got 50 quid for it, which is quite a lot, actually, for somebody. And Mans was obviously furious, and he challenged this. And he didn't mind the credit. I think it was the 50 quid that he was really, really upset about. And Mans pointed out that now Schallen was paid £600 a year, which was a lot in Victorian England. And Mans's salary was 150 odd. So he needed the money compared to this other guy. But the Schallen said, well, I'm in charge of this orchestra and this music, so any music that comes my way, I claim. Mans was offered £1 for his efforts, but then he wrote a letter to the Musical World magazine, which took up his case, and the Musical World all fell on Mans's side. Schallen was dismissed by George Grove. August Mans was appointed music director on the 14th of October, 1855, and that is the beginning of a lot of significant music as far as the Crystal Palace was concerned. For starters, he took things into a different direction. He was very keen to add a symphony orchestra to the established band and introduce more what he then called unfashionable music and promoting new music, and especially British new music. So if you think of those elements, there's quite a lot of sort of early proms ideas in what Manns was trying to do. First thing he did was, well, we need a really big musical event. He came up with the idea of Handel festivals. Now, in 1859 was to be the centenary of Handel. So Victorians did nothing on a small scale. So they decided to have a great big Handel festival that would run for 3 days in 1859 to celebrate the music of Handel. So they had a practice festival in 1857. This illustration from the Illustrated London News hopefully gives you an idea of the size of the audience and the size of the orchestra and the choir for the festival performances. The choir was about 2,000 strong. There are about 400 instrumentalists there. And here you see the great Handel organ. Excuse me, talking too much already. Which was actually designed by Gray and Davison, one of the other exhibitors at the Great Exhibition. And the 1857 festival had an audience of 40,000 over 3 days. Made a profit as well, £9,000 in 3 days. And that set the pattern for the Handel festivals that were going to continue every year, well, every 3 years after 1859. 1859 came, they used the same pattern, and it was even more successful. 3 days in June, and the performers expanded to 3,500. And just to see the final rehearsal, the audience that attended was over 20,000 people. Now, if you can, the Albert Hall can seat about 5,000, I think. So and this is a huge concert hall, a concert performance area that we are talking here, that is, we're talking sort of as if you were at Wembley Stadium almost for the size of it for a concert. These are posters which give you an idea. This is for the 1862 Handel Festival, because it was so popular they decided to hold it every 3 years. And there are certain Handel oratorios that were always sung, like the Messiah. These are in the Crystal Palace Foundation's own collection. And this is Israel and Egypt was also an incredibly popular work. And this score over here was sent to us. You can see a name scribbled up there, and that's a name called Mary Whitchurch, and it was sent to us by somebody in the Whitchurch family. And Mary Whitchurch sang this at the Crystal Palace, and this is her own score. And it's still got her markings on the score, which I find lovely. When you open it, and you can see where she's marked up certain bars of music in different ways. Mary Whitchurch died in 1933, and we're delighted that the family chose us to look after her score. This gives you an idea of the size of the performance area. That's the section of the Crystal Palace which is used for the Handel festivals that I just showed you the illustration for. These are other famous concert performance areas in the rest of the UK. This is Westminster Abbey. Up here, that's Birmingham Town Hall. Where else we got? There's the Philharmonic Hall. There's York Minster. So the Crystal Palace is setting itself up as the centre of music making, just by size alone. And there were music became to be developed for every occasion under August Manns as the MD of music at the Crystal Palace. He came up with the idea of Saturday concerts. Every Saturday there would be a concert of national, international music, way before the proms were thought of, and introducing what he thought was less fashionable music. Now, we'll come to that and we'll have a look at some first performances, and if we can organise the tech in a minute, we'll play some of the music to you that was first performed at the Crystal Palace before we hit the break. So there were first performances in the UK of music by people that we now think of as standard repertoire. This just gives you an idea of where before I get to that, the size of the Crystal Palace and the scale of it. Here's that Handel area for performance where there was the 20,000 audience and all those singers and instrumentalists. They also had a smaller concert hall, a smaller opera house, and this is the rest of the Crystal Palace, with the water towers would be over. So you can see what a vast structure it was, with music making right in the centre. These are three composers whose music was first heard in the Crystal Palace by a British audience. They were unfashionable. They were as unfashionable as Schubert on the left here, Mozart in the middle, and Mendelssohn on the right-hand side. Those were unfashionable. People, a British Victorian audience, didn't really give much for them. But Manns thought differently, because he was a European and had very much brought European taste. And one of the first works he premiered was one by Schubert. I'm going to step off this grand podium and see if we can just play a little extract. He played Schubert's 9th Great C Major Symphony for the very, very first time. Oh, if I can find out where things are on this. This is where the lights down don't work very well, isn't it? Let's just minimize the presentation for a minute. Here we are. Yeah, here we go. I think we can press that. Just about, thank you. Oh, the lighting technician is here. Right, which is the volume on here? Should be a good volume. Here we go. This is a piece you also might know, which is another one of Schubert's. This was first heard by a British audience in the Crystal Palace. Pause it there. Somebody's going to tell me what that was. Yell. Well done. Excellent. Thank you. I'm glad somebody got it. Yeah. So that's Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, his Symphony number 8. So imagine yourself not in this church in Streatham, but sitting in the Crystal Palace in that amazing space, and you are in the audience, and you are the first UK audience to hear that piece of music. I'll work my way back. I hope I left the pointer up there. We'll come back to a couple of other pieces in a moment as well, but I'll play those after we've had the break, and I can set those up during the break. Mozart was really unfashionable. You'll hear a piece of his after the break. Mendelssohn had his Reformation Symphony first performed in this country at the Crystal Palace. Because Mendelssohn had lived up the road in the 1830s, because he was a guest of the organist of St. Paul's Cathedral, who lived on Beulah Hill. and Mendelssohn stayed there for about 5 years as a guest. You can't get much more of a local connection to here as well. And because of the reception that Mann's got for the first Schubert symphony, all of Schubert's symphonies were first performed in the UK in the Crystal Palace. All of Schumann's symphonies were first performed in the Crystal Palace. There was such a clamour for this music that it went on and on. I'm going to, I see it's 8:15. Is that the time we have our little pause? So it's a good place to stop? Right. Well, I will pause there, and then we'll pick up with these great composers after you've had. How long do you have for a break? About 15 minutes. Okay. Well, about 8:30, I'll crack on and tell you a bit more. Hello, everybody. I hate to interrupt the glass of wine and everything. I'm going to play you another piece of music, which I hope you recognise as well, which is by one of these chaps up here. Again, imagine you're in the Crystal Palace, and you are listening to this as a British audience for the first time. And I have to pause it, I'm sorry about that, because I've got so much else to tell you. Who knows what that was? Mozart, well done. Well, it had to be one of those three, so it was a fairly safe bet. Yeah, that was the Mozart Eine kleine Nacht music. Been heard all over the place. I'll get out of range of the other microphones, I think. I'll come back up here. Mozart was quite unfashionable. He'd only died in 1791, but by the 1850s, people didn't really rate Mozart. It was old-fashioned. But August Mans got him listened to again. And if you'd have been sitting in the Crystal Palace at a Saturday concert, you would have been the first British audience to hear that piece of music in the UK. Let's look at some other composers that had their work premiered. Let's see if we can crack on with it. Hang on a minute, there we go. Now, I've got to try. Here we go. That's a technical issue. My tech team is arriving. Right, how about I just tell you a few things while we're sorting this out? So we've got these three chaps. The next slide would be three more very, very just standard repertoire musicians. When they come up, eventually, you'll be able to see them. But Robert Schumann would be on the left. Brahms would be in the middle, and Tchaikovsky would be on the right of the next slide, whenever that is. I'll stand away from here so I don't get any feedback. That's the slide that you've got there, so that's the one I want. I tell you what, I've done one of these before, and the data projector didn't work at all, so we put my laptop on a pile of books for the audience. So we've had worse. And as I said, so Mans thought Schumann was... Schumann had only died in 1856, and all of his symphonies were given an airing at the Crystal Palace. Brahms was a sort of natural successor to Beethoven, really. And Beethoven's... and Brahms's first symphony is often referred to as... Beethoven's 10th, because you can hear the sort of similar style and so on. And Brahms had pieces first performed at the Crystal Palace as well that were just fresh off the pen. So he wanted his work performed at the Crystal Palace for the first time. We'll get there. I'm absolutely certain we will. I might have to forget the last piece of music if it does this to it. The Brahms Violin Concerto was first performed at the Crystal Palace. Oh, here we go, that's much better. We're getting there, it's good. And his Academic Festival Overture was first performed in the UK at the Crystal Palace. That was only written, I think, in 1880, and that was written for a university. It was the Academic Festival Overture, and it was written for the students of the University of Breslau in Germany. And it's full of student songs. And the famous last section is Gaudiamus Igitur, and they have a hunting song in it as well. Just a year later, it got its first performance in the UK at the Crystal Palace. Shall I just crack on? I'll tell you what, I'll go up here and talk, and as soon as that's fixed, there we go. And, okay, manually is fine. I mean, I can come down there and do it if you like. I could do what Chris Whitty used to do on those COVID things and just keep shouting out, next slide, please. So Brahms had music first performed at the Crystal Palace, and his Second Symphony was first performed at the Crystal Palace for a UK audience. Tchaikovsky had music first performed at the Crystal Palace in the UK. Others, Dvorak, Sanson, Richard Strauss, and, oh, here we are. Sorry, what do I do? Have you got the, the flipper? Yeah. Good.
I'm afraid it's not on presentation mode, right?
I don't care. You'll be all right with that, won't you? Good. Right. Well, here's the people I've just been telling you about. I think just for safety's sake, I won't play you the Tchaikovsky clip. Plus, I can see what the time is as well. But yeah, Schumann's there, and Brahms in the middle, and Tchaikovsky on the right. Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet Overture was first performed at the Crystal Palace. That's what I would have played you, by the way, but I'm not going to risk that in case the presentation goes down again. And famous performers of the 19th century all flocked to play at the Crystal Palace from all over Europe. It became the centre of music making, not just for the UK, but for a lot of Europe as well. So these are two very, very, very famous pianists. On the left, you have Franz Liszt, who came and performed at the Crystal Palace. And he was like a sort of rock star in the middle of the 19th century. And that's Clara Schumann, Robert Schumann's wife, who was an acclaimed pianist. And if you haven't heard her own piano concerto, Robert Schumann wrote a fantastic piano concerto in A minor, and Clara Schumann also wrote a super A minor piano concerto. And, you know, place of women in the 19th century was not fantastic if you're a musician or anything. And a lot of Clara Schumann's music is now being brought to public attention, about time. Other performers, these also all came to conduct their own music. That's Dvorak, who gave world premieres at the Crystal Palace, conducting his own music. The centre person is Camille Saint-Saëns. So Dvorak, one of the pieces that he first performed as a world premiere was his Capriccioso, his Scherzo Capriccioso. There was a tone poem called La Rouille d'un Fall that Saint-Saëns composed and conducted for the first time ever at the Crystal Palace. The guy on the right is homegrown. So that's Arthur Sullivan. And not only did he do the fantastic operettas with W.S. Gilbert, but he wrote some amazing orchestral music as well. His symphonies were first performed at the Crystal Palace, conducted by him, of course. And Manns was very, very keen on promoting other British composers, so not only Sullivan, but Stanford, Parry, Edward German, Walford Davis. And clearly it was the place to be. And musicians gravitated there. And sometimes they would try and, a young musician who would come to greater things would then move there. Edward Elgar lived very, very close to Crystal Palace Park. He was, of course, lived down in Worcestershire, and he was a kind of jobbing musician down in Worcestershire, but he knew that the centre of the music scene was the Crystal Palace. So in the 1880s, I think, 1889, he decided to go to Upper Norwood. And this is a contemporary map, but just there is Crystal Palace Park as we know it. What we would now know as Fountain Drive about there, I can't quite see from here. But he had a house which is no longer there, just on that corner. So he was right at the centre of music making. It didn't quite work out for him. Elgar, with a wife and a young family, found it a bit of a struggle. He did have pieces first performed at the Crystal Palace as well. In 1897, his 3 dances from the Bavarian Highlands. But he found he could make better headway and a better living as a violin teacher back in Worcester. So that's where he eventually ended up. But he did go on to write further music that was premiered at the Crystal Palace. This is a huge festival that happened in 1911 called the Festival of Empire. And I was talking to some people at half-time, and the Crystal Palace did go through some very dodgy financial moments and went bust a couple of times and was in very dire straits financially just before the First World War. And they thought, well, what should we do? Well, let's have a big event. And they called it the Festival of Empire. And it was coincided with the coronation of George V and Queen Mary. And they came and opened this great Festival of Empire on the 12th of May, 1911. And streets were lined with cheering crowds, and there was a royal box in the centre transept. This is the opening concert. And you're getting familiar, I think, with the scale of the concert performances. Just here, all these people sitting around here. This is the orchestra in the centre, but the choir that came together was 4,500 voices, and they sang the national anthem. They had what they called the Festival Empire Military Band in scarlet uniforms. Imperial Choir was composed of 49 of the leading choral groups in the Greater London area. And there were some from Beckenham and Penge and the Bromley Choral Society. And to go with this, they had an outdoor exhibition as well, which is this. And they tried to recreate a miniature British Empire. And of course, and there's some around there somewhere, there we are, there's a bandstand right in the middle of it. And they made little replica buildings of all the sort of central civic government buildings of lots of empire countries in those days, from South Africa to India to Canada. I have to say that the displays, again, weren't fantastically PC, but it was their way of portraying things. And probably if you want to debate empire and commonwealth, you probably get another speaker to do that. It did, and there's even, and you see this, this was called the Red Route Line, and that was a little train that used to go round. Before, I don't know if anybody's ever been to Legoland Windsor, where you can get a little tour of all the different miniature places. This was like that, only years in advance. And there was this train that you could just get on about every 5 minutes that would give you a little tour of the whole empire. And all these little stations of different nations. And you get an idea of what it was like, how they transformed the grounds in these postcards. Again, these are in the collection of the foundation. Now, it didn't quite work. It didn't make the money they wanted it to. It included yet more premieres. Gustav Holst wrote a piece of music for it, those of you who know the Planet Suite. So he wrote something called The Praise of King Olaf, which was first performed at the Crystal Palace in 1911, and then the Crystal Palace went bust again, and then there was the First World War. But there was one more major musical initiative, and that was the National Brass Band competitions. Now, they'd started to have these back in the 1860s, but come 1900, there was a huge brass banding movement, and often attached to great industries like car manufacturers and coal mines, and they had their brass band. And the centerpiece for the national competition was the Crystal Palace. And the Crystal Palace Band still plays and dates from the 19th century. I have friends that play in the Crystal Palace Band, and they still do competitions. And You've got the, Millie moved on, spoiler alert on that one. Press the wrong button. So this is a poster from the 1900 band contest, which was the first really of the ones that they held constantly every year. This is 29 years later. And of course, we're into the 1930s now. And this happened. I was talking to somebody just down the front there and said, so the 30th of November, 1936, was when we thought it all ended. It hasn't quite, the musical story doesn't quite finish there. I'll spare you the details of the fire. I'm sure there's always a fire question wherever I go and talk. But there is a musical connection to the fire, and that's this. And this is the piece they were rehearsing on the night of the fire. The only people in the Crystal Palace building on the night of 30th of November 1936 was the orchestra practicing a new piece by Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, who lived fairly locally to here. He was a Croydon lad, and he often came to the Crystal Palace performing and premiering his work. And A Tale of Old Japan, I have to admit it's not one of his best, but this is an original score. Again, this is in my collection, so you won't see it again. Unless I come back again to do the talk number 6. I'm sure we'll think of something. Fortunately, the alarm was raised and all the musicians got out safely. Nobody died in the fire. Not even a musician was, or their trombone was damaged. And that's one of the reasons we don't know why the fire happened, because there was no inquiry. Nobody died. Although I was talking to somebody who'd had the very intelligent sense to buy one of our books on the Crystal Palace fire, which we commissioned actually is by a guy called Robert Knowles, and he has one theory that he proposes in it. I won't spoil it for you. You'll have to either get it from the stall or off our website. But it's almost nice to think that music was there at the end, but that's not quite the end. There were more musical performances in the 1930s as they were trying to maximise and sweat the asset they had in Crystal Palace Park from the bank holiday fairs and celebrations. There was always music as part of it. And then we had the Second World War. And, of course, a totally different Crystal Palace Park as there had been during the First World War. But after a period of recovery, they thought, well, let's resuscitate music in Crystal Palace Park again. And this is stuff that quite a few of us in this room, I'm just looking round, we're of a bit of a demographic, I think. I think we can share a few memories. And the Crystal Palace Concert Bowl was opened in June 1961. And it was a fantastic venue for going. And there were great concerts. I'm sure lots of us here remember going to the Crystal Palace Concert Bowl in the summer and sitting there with our picnics, possibly under a great big umbrella, listening to a great concert of orchestral music. The LSO and RPO and all the great orchestras came, lots of great conductors too, keeping that musical tradition going. And they will have played pieces that were first performed in the UK back in the 19th century. So it's really nice to have that thread. But it was not just for classical music, because 10 years later, they had this other idea. And it became a great pop venue. They called it a garden party. And they had Pink Floyd and the Faces performing on the same stage as the LSO had performed. And they had so many other people come and perform. They had the Beach Boys. They had Elton John. I was talking to somebody about when Bob Marley came to play at the Crystal Palace Concert Bowl. For those of you who like your lighter music, Andy Williams. So you name it, they all came. So a bit like the 19th century, when all the pop stars came like Liszt, the same thing happens. Rod Stewart thought, I need somewhere to sing, I'll go to Crystal Palace Park. So they all came still. And what we have now, of course, is a different concert bowl. This is the latest version, which is affectionately known locally as the rusty laptop. I have to say, I've performed on both as a musician. I performed in the old concert bowl, and I performed in that one. Now, with respect to the architects I spoke to earlier, this is designed by a very famous architect who won awards. But as a musician, what you don't do is make an outdoor performance area without sides to it, because the wind just goes straight the way through and blows everything everywhere. So the concert bowl itself was much better to play in because it was enclosed. It was enclosed, and it was a lovely stage to play on. Backstage, the facilities for the musicians for the old concert bowl were terrible. The facilities for musicians for the new one were very much better. So, he takes your money, he pays your money, he takes your choice, I suppose. So, concert bowl. And the park is now under new management. It's been put under the management of a trust. It's no longer run by the London Borough of Bromley, where it just about sits in. And the Crystal Palace Park Trust runs it. And 2023, I think September, is when it came into being officially, and it's nice that they use the term garden party for their big festival opening, because they had loads of music on, just like they use the term garden party when they had the Beach Boys and Rod Stewart and Pink Floyd playing. So it's a Crystal Palace term for music making. It's right there now, and if you want to know anything else, you can go to our website. There's lots there. If you want to get in touch, that's our foundation email. I hope we got a few moments for questions. Sorry about the technical glitch, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.